Hi there, and welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor Cybersecurity mini-series podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallas, brought to you in collaboration with our friends at Proofpoint. Now, for those of you who are new to the show, what's the show about? Well, the show is all about raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an organisational culture where cybersecurity is truly valued. Now, for all our listeners who've been listening over the last 4 years, one thing you'll know is that we're really proud of our ability to bring in guests from both within the cybersecurity industry, but also actually predominantly from outside of the cybersecurity industry as well. Our guests for within cyber tend to be CISOs, education awareness managers, and security professionals responsible for that really big responsibility of addressing the human factor within their organizations. And then we also have guests from outside of the cybersecurity industry who are either academics or practitioners, or sometimes they're academics and practitioners that specialize in human aspects of awareness, behavior, and culture, or bringing around change in that in human awareness, behavior, and culture. And people that I think, by the very nature of what they do, there are insights from what they do which we could take away and consider how they might be applied when it comes to rethinking the human factor. So our guest that we have for you today is responsible for education and awareness within a major healthcare organization. And I think what I found really interesting about our guest was that it wasn't just the work that they were doing that was interesting. Obviously, it was the work that they'd done beforehand, which has got them into a position where they were able to then sort of, use their previous experience to help with the content development side of the education and awareness piece within that particular organization. And then the success of that has then meant that they've sort of moved into other areas when it comes to employee education and awareness. So without any further ado, let's get on with that interview. Hi there, welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallas. And it's fantastic to have you here with us all on the show. Those of you who are new to the show, what is the show briefly all about? Well, the show is all about raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an organizational culture where security is truly valued. That's right. And one of the things we like to do on the show is to get, really interesting guests. Some of our guests come from outside of the security industry, and some of our guests come from within the security industry. And our guest today is one of those insiders, but who originally sort of came from outside the industry. And he's got a really interesting story to tell in terms of where he's come from and where he's got to, and then sort of talking about his own experiences around, the challenges of education awareness, but ultimately around bringing changes in behavior and culture. So without any further ado, let's get on with that interview. So, Corwin, great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Bruce. I've listened to countless episodes of this podcast, and it's just been so helpful for me in our journey for better security awareness and training and behavior and culture. And I'm just thrilled to be here.
Thank you very much. It would be great. I remember because we did an exchange of messages, and then we've obviously had a conversation as well. And I just remember your story, where you've come from, and the way you told it, and I was like, oh, that's such a great story, and how it's led you to where you are now. So and it's great, because I just think, as I listen to your story, there is so much of what you say that when you think, when you've heard previous episodes, you're like, oh, that ties in with that, and that ties in with that episode. And so in many ways, you're sort of like a personification of a lot of what we've been covering within the show and at the Rethinking Human Factor program. And so it's brilliant to have you on the show. And yeah, it's I'm really looking forward to spending an hour with each other and pushing some ideas around. So we always ask this question of everybody that comes on the show. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what it is you do and the journey that you've been on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll kind of start with kind of what I'm doing now, and then we'll kind of back up a little bit into kind of my history. So right now I am in my second role as a security awareness ambassador at a fairly large global organization. So I am largely responsible for our security communications, as well as training initiatives and employee engagement activities to really help build security as part of our culture. And so that's kind of my current role. And I'll kind of back up a little bit and kind of talk a little bit about kind of how I got to where I am today. So the first part of my story really actually starts when I was really between the ages of about 10 and 12 years old. And my parents brought out their gigantic old VHS camcorder. And as a 10-year-old, I saw that camcorder and was just enamored with imaginative ideas, creative storylines that I wanted to create with that camera and my friends. And so after getting their permission, I grabbed that camera, and for several years we would create, stories that probably wouldn't make any sense to me now. But as a child, we would film all these videos on this VHS camcorder, and we would get all excited about it. And really from that point, every couple of years, I started to get other video cameras. I just loved video production. I loved the feeling of putting together stories and having a group be a part of that. And so, after I went through high school, that was kind of a big part of kind of my growth in video production, because when I graduated from high school, I obtained the opportunity to purchase my very first DSLR camera. And when I did that, it kind of opened up this whole world of photography and videography at a level that I hadn't had access to previously. And so I grabbed that camera, and then from that point on, it just accelerated. And I started to do some video work for some local friends and organizations that, my parents had relationships with.
Yeah.
And from there, started to buy more equipment, and actually started my own video production company locally in West Michigan, which is where I grew up in the US, and started doing that. And that actually influenced kind of where I went to school. And so, running this video production company made me become kind of interested in marketing. And so I went to school for marketing, thinking that kind of that degree path would mesh really well with the video production passion that I had on the side. And so I went and got a bachelor's degree in marketing and continued to kind of run my own video production company before I got my first job at a local healthcare organization doing video production and marketing for their physicians.
Okay.
And so
so what was that particular role there? Well, I've got another question. I've got a question. I was just imagining this, you as a 12-year-old, that VHS camera was massive, wasn't it? If I remember rightly.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Yeah. So how the hell did you hold that on your shoulder?
Yeah, I could tell you, I would have a bruise occasionally up on my right shoulder where I'd be holding on to that camera, because that was a massive camera. And sometimes we would try to set it up on a table and then act in front of it just because it was so massive. We didn't necessarily always want to hold on to it. But as I got older and stronger, it became less of an issue. So.
Yeah. I had this picture in my mind. I was like, you must have lent to if you were right-handed, I can imagine you being on your shoulder and your right hand and then just leaning over and you're having to counteract that weight on your shoulder.
Yeah.
Anyway, away from that particular picture. So this first job then in healthcare, tell us more about that.
Yeah. So this first job in healthcare was incredibly eye-opening. And so kind of what I did was I worked with a group of physician relations departments. And so those were team members that were designed to help physicians with their community outreach and their perception and their overall branding across our community. And part of that was creating bio videos that would aid patients in making a decision around what physician they were going to go and see. And so in that role, I traveled all across the Michigan community, sometimes even hours away. And I met with hundreds of physicians. I would sit them down in front of a camera. We would do an interview and we would talk about, why are they a physician? What are some key elements to what makes them unique? And, why do they and how do they care for their patients? Things like that. And we would create these bio videos. And then that way, as a patient is online and they're searching for who am I going to go see next in regards to their provider, their physician, they can make a much more personal decision and have much more of a personal touch to that decision by watching this bio video around their physician, because there's so much more that can be communicated versus, just a a written profile with that added visual and audio element, right? And so, yeah, so I did that for hundreds of providers, learned all about the healthcare industry, and it was a very, very rewarding and fascinating experience.
So let me get this straight. So like that first role within that healthcare organization provider that you were working with. So the role was about how do you help existing customers, potential customers who needed to have medical, we'll call them interventions, operations or some form of medical clinic. Was it all clinical treatment or was it anything else other than clinical treatment? I'm just trying to think, were these actual operations? Or was it physiotherapy and other sort of outpatient type of things that they were doing? I'm just trying to be clear in my head.
Sure. So in regards to, these bio videos and profiles, it was for physicians of really all specialties. So what that means is whether it's someone's primary care provider or someone that, they realized, oh my gosh, I need to schedule surgery, right? Or I need to pick someone to do heart surgery, right? And sometimes you can't always pick, but in situations where you can, we did create bio videos for, a variety of physicians. In fact, we even would create bio videos for intensive care unit, like nurses and physicians, where many times if someone gets sent to the ICU, they never even meet the provider that's caring for them. But many times families do, or families might be told, here is the name of the provider that's caring for your loved one. And so we would create these videos so that, a family who might have a family member in the ICU might be able to connect more with that provider, even virtually, without necessarily being able to have an easy way to meet with them.
Yeah, I mean, that would be quite, when you think about it, if you've got a loved one who's having to have intensive care treatment and maybe, you want to know more about the team that's giving them that intensive care, and you get a degree of comfort from knowing that that your loved one is in the right hands or in good hands, being able to see those videos would actually be quite helpful, because you've probably, like you said, you've probably never there's a fair chance you've not even met them, or maybe you've met the physician but not the whole team. Okay, so let's go back to that. So basically what the healthcare provider was trying to do is to provide information to people on a platform to help them make decisions about which clinicians or physicians that they wanted to engage with, to work with, whether it be on surgery or physiotherapy, any type of discipline from a medical perspective. So part of that challenge then was about getting them to actually engage with the platform, wasn't it? So, and is that why they chose video over just that written format? Did they find that the video seemed to be more engaging than just written text and a picture, for example?
Absolutely. I think video has a way and an opportunity to communicate and hit emotions more than, merely, a written profile. Videos from a marketing standpoint can easily be shared on social media. We experience many instances where a patient who had a phenomenal experience with a physician would share their bio videos online. And sometimes that would make a lot of traction and really help a physician's, branding, right, in the community. Perhaps, one of the things that was challenging that I didn't expect in that role was many times I would arrive at an office and set up my camera equipment, be ready for the scheduled time. And either the physician wouldn't show up initially and I'd have to go and find them, or they would show up and, say things like, what are we doing and why are we doing this? I don't want to do this. I refuse to do this. Okay. And so as an intern, and then eventually I was hired full time for that role, I really had to take a very, strong sense of empathy in meeting with these physicians. Many times they didn't even know, even though we might communicate with them, right, via email, we might send a lot of information their way. Physicians are very busy. They don't always see these communications. And so I would have to sit down with them and in a span of, 15 minutes, not only convince them to do something they have told me they refuse to do, but hopefully be able to put together an exceptional product that would help them with their branding and with their marketing and their perception within the community. And so that was quite surprising to me. I really thought, oh, this will be easy. We're just going to set up the cameras. And, furthermore, even in that, physicians that are really good at surgeries sometimes would also be incredibly nervous and uncomfortable in front of camera. And so that was an additional challenge. And I think over time, I was able to develop a lot of different strategies and became much better at facilitating those interviews and helping them feel as comfortable as possible.
So I think that's really interesting. So what you are doing is a positive for the clinicians that you're actually videoing, wasn't it? I mean, it was in their interest that they create these bios. The intention was to obviously get people to engage with them to take up their services, but yet you still had people who were resistant to that. And have you ever wondered, why is it that something that's going to help them is still something that they didn't want to take part in? Or does that allude to the point you make, which is that sometimes people who are incredibly confident at doing what they're doing and very competent, when you take them out of the situation that they're used to, they suddenly feel a loss of control and they lose their confidence. And that sort of, I guess, creates a sort of a reaction which is more defensive.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And, in light of many physicians who were exceptional at providing some of the most complex surgeries that are available in our world today, right? It would feel this immense lack of control. There would be even concerns around, are you going to publish this video without me being able to see it, right? And certainly we always would share these bio videos with these physicians before publishing them. They always had that opportunity to review them. Yeah. But I think that, you hit a really interesting point, and it definitely does connect with awareness in that, many times, even when something is in the best interest of someone, even if I think this is so obvious, how would you not want to do this, right? It doesn't mean that even if you explain it in the way that you think is best, that is going to be sufficient to help someone actually feel comfortable doing what really is in their best interest. And so sometimes what I would have to do with these providers or these physicians is actually spend the majority of our time together, even if it meant that I only got, 6 to 7 minutes of interview time with them on camera. Sometimes I would sit down and just say, well, talk to me about, why are you feeling uncomfortable, and really empathize with them and say, you know what, I totally understand where you're coming from. And I'm really, sorry maybe that we didn't explain this right. Coming at a place of humility and just saying, you know what, maybe there's something that I could do next time that would be better for you to feel more comfortable. Didn't always guarantee a good result, but in the majority of cases, that was a key element to helping them feel comfortable with me, which then enabled them to feel comfortable with the real request, which was, we need to put this video together because it's going to help you, help our community, and help the organization as a whole.
So did you find, when you were doing these videos, the initial thing that this wasn't your idea to do the videos, well, it sort of was your idea actually, but you were working with other colleagues and they had the idea of creating these portfolios for each one of the clinicians. Did they give you like a standard set of questions to ask everybody, or did they give you a standard set of questions that you had to ask everybody?
Yeah. When I started as an intern, there was kind of this standard list of, here are the key questions and things that we feel would be best to cover. And I'll just mention too that, these videos, this kind of project of videoing these providers had started a few months before I became an intern. And then I kind of joined the organization and was largely leading the production of these videos for quite some time afterward. But when I initially joined, there was this subset of questions. Here are the things we want you to ask. And I quickly realized that, while those questions might get at the heart of the content we're looking for, over time, I started really developing more of a conversational approach, something where, each provider is different. And I know the types of content we're looking for, but sometimes the order of the questions, or sometimes the order of that content, or the ways that I need to engage with that person is going to be unique to them. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And so eventually I just kind of ditched the questions the way that they had them. And I thought, okay, I know what I'm looking for, and each provider might require a slightly unique approach to obtain that. And so I walked into it with more of a conversational approach and focused on it from that perspective.
Yeah, that was it, isn't it? The conversation. So you go in with like, here's the 10 questions, Corbin, that you need to ask each person you interview. But you actually quite quickly realize, especially if you've got people that are being resistant to getting involved in that process through a lack of confidence or whatever the reason, the point you make about, it's almost like empathy. To me, it's almost like warming up somebody through using conversation rather than questions. I've seen podcasts where people get asked, 10 questions and they just answer the question and then move on to the next question. And you just don't, for me personally, it just doesn't feel like a particularly warm conversation. Whereas I think the approach you sort of moved to was, I'll just talk with these people and I'll listen and I'll ask the right questions. And from that, we'll be able to get, some good content, which is very much what you were doing, wasn't it? I mean, that your work was to produce content, which was then used to communicate with potential customers and existing customers to help them make decisions about who they wanted to get their treatment with.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us a little bit more about something that I'm quite interested in here, because I often get involved in conversations with people. They say, well, just grab your phone and take a video. What's the actual process that you have to go through to come up with video content itself? Because yes, you can just grab a phone and stick it in front of somebody and do a video. And some people would argue that actually, the trend has been for a couple of years now for almost like raw material, it hasn't been edited and produced in a highly polished way. But what is the actual process? Just so the listeners can get a sense of, to produce a video, I need to follow these key steps.
The first thing that kind of came to mind that I do just want to say is, and it's kind of cheesy, right? But the best camera is the one that you have with you, not necessarily always, the best equipment out there. And I think one of the things sometimes that stops people from engaging in video production is they think, well, I don't have the equipment to do that, or I don't have the software to do that. And I just want to say that, certainly equipment and software can help kind of gauge our quality level, but certainly don't allow those things to become barriers as you enter into doing, video production. And so kind of with that, I can kind of talk about, I kind of have 4 key questions I ask before saying yes to a video project. And then if I do say yes, and then I kind of have a couple key steps to kind of how that project would flow. And so, before I ever say even yes to a video project, the first question I would ask is, what is the problem we are solving, right? And so sometimes, leaders especially will think, well, we need a video on this. Once you start putting together videos and people see it, they might think, wow, you make really cool content. Let's make this into a video. And I always try to take a step back and think, okay, is there actually a problem we are solving? And sometimes it could be as simple as, in cybersecurity, we might be part of educating a user and minimizing our risk by reinforcing a particular behavior and doing that through a video. And in that sense, maybe that is part of, the problem we are solving. And so if there is truly a problem we are solving and, there's something really worthy of communicating through video, and then I take a further step and I think, okay, what is the impact of that video? So how large is the audience? How impactful of a solution is the video towards the problem that we are solving, right? Because video might be one aspect of an entire initiative or an entire project, an engagement that maybe our cybersecurity department, for example, might be having with the organization. The third question would be, what is the shelf life of that video? I kind of like the analogy of, whenever you go to a grocery store and you're shopping for groceries, just about everything you can buy has an expiration date. Yeah. And furthermore, if I'm at a grocery store and something doesn't have an expiration date, that sometimes makes me feel a little concerned. And in the same way, I actually treat videos the same way, right? If someone tells me, this video is going to last forever, I take a pause and I think, I don't know about that. That might be a little concerning. However, how long a video can survive without needing an edit or without being updated, that is something really important to consider, because you don't want to put yourself into a position where you're constantly having to recreate videos. And then kind of the fourth key question, and this is going to lead right into our steps of kind of video production, is you have to be realistic and you have to ask yourself, how much time will this take, right? Sometimes I've literally had it where I've been requested to make a video and it is 5 p.m., at the end of the day, they say, we need a video. And by the way, we're sending it out tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., right? That is a legitimate request. And I have to be realistic. How much time will this take? Is that even feasible? In many cases, if not all cases, it's not, right?
So you need some sort of nighttime vision camera for that type of work, don't you? You work at this time.
Yeah, exactly.
I can do it, but it's all going to have this very green tint around it.
Exactly. It might look a little bit different than what you're thinking, but
I'll have some of those goggles that you see the sort of, the armed forces wearing for my cameras. Anyway, and that's an incredibly expensive bit of kit. But anyway, go back to time, because I think it's a really important point.
Yeah. So I think, you really have to be realistic with how much time it will take. And so really to measure that requires experience. And so you have to really understand, what kind of experience you have with video production, how much is involved, whether it's filming, whether it's animating, all of those elements are going to take time. And then you also have to think about your stakeholders. There's always going to be someone that says, I want, or I need to review that video before you use it. And you have to think about who are those people, make sure you identify them, and make sure that list isn't too long. Because if that list is too long, your video will forever be in a review state of changes and opinions, and you'll never be able to release it. And so you really need to think about those things.
Yeah, that's really, because the thing is, I know, because people tell me, Bruce, just do a quick video. So I do short videos. I'm like, actually, it's, the video might be like 2 minutes long, but actually the amount of effort that goes into producing a 2-minute video, even one of my own videos, I'm like, it's a lot more than I would have ever thought. And so I think you just have to have realistic expectations. And if you're going to be, videoing people, there's the review process, but there's also, if you decide to actually have people in the videos, who's available? When are they available? The work that you did around these physicians is like, okay, you have to schedule probably weeks ahead, if not further. You want an interview with the chief exec. She's not going to be available necessarily tomorrow unless it's her idea to do the video.
Exactly. And going off the physician's example, right? If you don't bake in flexibility, you're creating a situation where you are more likely to fail if even just one small thing changes. And so you also have to keep that in mind when you're scheduling a project. So absolutely.
Okay So what's the benefit? What's the impact of this if we go ahead with it? What's the shelf life? How long is this video content going to be expected to last without us tweaking the edges and maybe trying to update the content? So a video done in the 70s of everybody wearing flares isn't necessarily going to be in context in the 2020s, is it?
Right.
Spurs might be coming back. Anyway, that's another conversation. So after shelf life, then it's the matter of time. Okay, so those are the 4 key steps. And then you've got the actual production of the video. You've got the actual production piece. You've then got the editing. You've then got the review process. And that gets you to your final piece of content.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So that was a nice short introduction to videography. Tell us something about what it is that you've been up to now. That this is your second role, isn't it, now, in relation to education and awareness? Tell us a little bit more about, some of the challenges that you've seen across those 2 roles and how you've potentially gone about addressing those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll kind of start with an example. So when I was at that healthcare organization, after doing those physician videos for quite some time, I really looked for kind of what would be my next step in my career. And at the time, I kind of forgot to mention this as part of the, first role I had, but my dad actually is a manager in information security at that healthcare organization, and completely unrelated to his role. I actually applied for a security, awareness training specialist role at that healthcare organization, kind of thinking maybe that would be my next step. I've always loved education and training, had never heard of that role. I didn't even tell my dad actually that I had applied.
Right. Okay.
And so I applied to that, and through the interview process, I sat in, and one of the interviewers asked me, knowing my video production background, knowing that I had done these physician profile videos, he asked me, will you be comfortable never doing a video again? Because previously in these awareness roles, they had never considered video as important. And so I said, well, sure. But in my mind, I was kind of laughing a little bit, thinking, I'm definitely going to be making videos in this role. I can't imagine we wouldn't. And so graciously, and I'm very thankful, but they brought me on board and I joined a team of 2. And in that first role within the healthcare organization, I learned a lot about privacy and security and how to really be able to take the video production skill sets that I had and use that as a vehicle of communication and training. And eventually, towards the end of my time there, video was the number one requested kind of service or item that we could produce as a team that was requested from us. And so certainly changed from our interview process. But one of the challenges we had was communicating changes and working with our security department. At a very large healthcare organization, many times what would happen is security would be seen as the department of no. So, departments would come up with these great ideas. They would find software they want. They would find all these new cool like bells and whistles that they want approved. They would go through everything, right? They go through every department. They'd make sure they have budget for it, all of that. And then sometimes if the process wasn't set up, ideally, security would be kind of the last stop. And if security is the last stop and they say no, that really starts to build a bad perception and a bad brand of security in the organization. And so that was a challenge that we took on and worked with our department holistically and looked at, how can we change our processes? How can we make sure that that's not the perception? And it requires a lot of patience and humility. And I think, a lot of credit to that security department. They did a fantastic job of really reworking processes to really not become the department of no, but really, become an enabler of the business to do things just in a more secure way, not necessarily, disabling ideas and things like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the whole no thing, and it chimes a bell with me because many years ago I was at InfoSec Europe, which is, I guess, probably the biggest information security conference exhibition that we have here in Europe. Very small compared to RSA over in the US, but still the biggest in Europe. And I did a presentation, and in that I was talking about Dr. No, who was the head of a function, and he was responsible for security. And that was one of the first things I did when I was there within this organization, the sense of it was a mini brand. I would do a mini brand audit to try and ascertain actually, what the customers thought of security, and sort of draw my own branding background from marketing. And it was like, okay, the security function thought A, but the customers thought B. So there was clearly a difference in between the two of them about what the brand was, and actually the customer's experience was exactly what you said, no. And the interesting point, which I think you allude to, is your experience was that the security function, to address it, instead of doing some slick marketing campaign to try and persuade people that they're wrong, these are our values and we are here all about helping. Actually, what they seem to do is they went to the root of it, which was, it's actually just the processes. It's not that, the people, it's the processes that need to be addressed. And I think that's a really important thing for our listeners to take away, actually. Sometimes it's not about a slick communication campaign to change the perception of the brand. It's actually about just doing things differently, isn't it?
Exactly. And, sometimes it can be considered a rude analogy, but, I've heard it said many times that, watch out for lipstick on a pig, right? It's still a pig. And sometimes security departments can, kind of glaze over, oh, look at this cool site or this cool handout or graphic, right? And in awareness and training, sometimes it can be tempting to put together a cool video or put together a cool handout. But if all we're doing is, making something that's already broken at the base and trying to make that look cool or attractive, you might flood people at first, but they're still going to realize that the base is broken. There's not a strong foundation. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think, a huge element to what I'm doing now in my current role is really looking at, how can we make the perception of security in the organization incredibly strong? And that doesn't happen based on siloed awareness training activities or culture and behavior activities. It really happens from an all team effort across security and engaging with all the different departments to understand how can we create a foundation that's really strong, built upon strong relationships, strong understanding, strong empathy, and just a very strong base of understanding across everyone, because that's really what's going to lead to strong success through that strong relational bond that you can have with others across the organization.
Completely agree with you. I think it's really important for the listeners to get their heads around that, because often what I've seen when I've been doing my research over the years is that, that whole people think that they're developing a more mature approach because they're starting to think about branding. They might actually be just thinking about the logos that they use on the paperwork and some of the color. But branding, real branding, that a marketeer would really sort of like go, I recognize that straight away, is not about what a small part of your business does, whether your business is the information security function within an organization or a whole organization itself, is about how every point of contact with the customer, how every point is aligned behind that brand, isn't it? And it's not just your education and awareness manager or ambassador and their team. It's not just their responsibility. The brand is owned by the whole of the information security function, not just education and awareness. I think that's really important. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you very
Absolutely.
much. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more. So we had the no department, okay, okay, which you helped transform into the I'd like to get to know you well, which that's a Kajagoogoo song. That's a really that's how old I am. I've just had a flashback to a Kajagoogoo song, which I think is the late 1980s. I'd like to get to know you well. It's definitely a Kajagoogoo title to a song. I'm going to have to double check that on Spotify. Anyway, so what else? What did you find once you'd sort of helped address that brand challenge? What other things did you sort of get your teeth into?
Yeah, so this is kind of a funny story, but about a month into my first role in awareness, I actually was almost certain that I was going to get fired. And I'll explain what happened. So I obtained leadership approval, and it was around tax time. And we just kind of consumed our internal phishing tool. And so, part of the idea behind internal phishing is, we send these phishing emails to mimic real world threats, and it gives employees the opportunity to practice identifying and reporting suspicious email. And I worked with leaders and I said, you know what? Here's what we need to do. We need to mimic the real world threats of cyber criminals impersonating the IRS. And so I put together an internal phishing email that was mimicking the IRS, and it, offered a link for our employees to click on. And so, we were really excited about this. We thought it was one of the most difficult campaigns we had launched. It mimicked really a real threat that we've seen. And so anyway, we sent that out, and several, employees clicked on it, employees reported it. And within less than 24 hours, an employee happened to decide that rather than reporting the email to our security department, they reported it to the IRS directly. And by doing that, I received a cease and desist letter from the IRS into our email. And I thought, for sure that I had really messed up and that I was going to get fired. And, luckily that didn't happen. And, we had obtained leadership approval and we pulled the campaign. And ultimately it was kind of a learning experience around two things, right? Especially related to simulated phishing. One of which is you really have to think about, if you are going to impersonate an actual organization, is that really the best call, right? Even if your leaders agree, is that really the best call? And then also, sometimes there is a focus on not necessarily trying to trick our employees in the organization to click these links, but sometimes security can get a little excited around the idea of creating really difficult campaigns, like we're going to catch them and we're going to catch these employees that are, clicking on emails, right? And I think you have to think about, what is the real purpose of simulated phishing, and, how is that really going to help your organization? And so, that was kind of one of my larger learning experiences, really, when it came to security awareness training and, getting into this field was, oh my gosh, we really have to think about what is our actual strategy. And, furthermore, kind of from that, what I've learned is there's a tendency in awareness training or even culture and behavior to start with, this is what we have to do, right? If a program is centered around compliance, or if they think about, okay, I know what it takes to have a successful program. It takes having training available. It takes having handouts, having videos, running simulated fishing. If we start with all of those things, we're going to not do it the best we can. And the reason is because when you start with what you have to do, you kind of create this checklist to get things done, but you're not necessarily heading in any particular direction other than, okay, I've done my training, I've done simulated fishing. What I try to start with is, what do we want this program to become? And when we do that, we find, well, we want the program to influence culture and behavior. We want those on our team and in the security department to be strong influencers within the culture of our organization. And when we start with, this is what we want to become, we also start removing some, I think what I even had entering the field, blinders. And I'll give an example, right? Many times in awareness and training, we'll have an initiative, or the security department has an initiative, and we might say, okay, the best way to communicate this change is if we can get a leader who has strong influence to also back and support this change, that will help our cause. And I'm not saying that, this is wrong, right? Many times this is something that you should do. However, sometimes we limit ourselves and say, we need to find someone to be that leader instead of realizing that's something we could become, right? And so when you think about how can you become the leader of influence, you realize to do that requires thinking beyond just security. If all I did in my job was, I'm only going to write blogs on security, I'm only going to do security related functions, I might just be missing a key step to engaging with employees, having employees want to follow me, having employees trust me, having relationships built. And so part of what I'm doing is thinking about, okay, what are some ways that I can become an influencer of culture? What are some ways I can become a leader? And then by doing that, I'm actually setting myself up for a success when something super important comes down the line and, oh my gosh, we have this training, we have this communication, we've got updates. I'm no longer hustling and bustling, trying to find that influencer leader. They still might help our cause, right? But because I might be already a leader and influencer, I'm going to be able to get my messages. I'm going to be able to get my training out way more efficiently.
It's interesting because we've mentioned the word brand. I think that's a phrase that a lot of our listeners and more broadly information security, cybersecurity, IT security industry is more familiar with. The idea that the security function has its own brand. But I remember it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago because of somebody who's close to me, and they were really focused around personal branding. And I'd never heard of personal branding, but I understood exactly. So I guess what you're saying, but it was just a different term for it. Everybody has their own personal brand. The way that everybody that you engage with perceives you and sees you is in effect your own personal brand. And a lot of business leaders, actually, especially those in the public domain, they work with personal branding consultants. And the idea is, you're positioning yourself where the phrase you use is what do you want to become, is about saying where do you want to be as an individual. And the way you were talking there is almost like, you're putting yourself as an influencer. And so your activities are geared towards almost developing that personal brand so that you can do what you need to do in your job role, the things that are important to you that you measure against, by using your personal brand. When we think of in social media context, social influencers, that are all around the world on the social media, that they're influencing they create groups of networks of people, followers, and then they drip feed them and they get paid handsomely for doing that. So I think it's really important because that is a stage that I do wonder when I speak to people about the personal brand side of things. And actually, do you know Cialdini, the sort of behavioural specialist, Cialdini, Robert Cialdini? I don't know if you've ever come across him at all.
I don't think so.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I sort of recommend you pick up one of his books, Robert Cialdini. I think, if I remember how to spell it, Caldini. And he's written quite a few books. He's quite an influencer when it comes to behavioural cognitive psychology, powers of influence. And if I remember right, his last book, as soon as I saw the title, I thought that just makes so much sense, because what he was basically doing is he calls it persuasion. Instead of persuading people to do something, it's persuading, which is all about positioning yourself prior to the person making a decision to increase the chances of them making a decision which results in a positive outcome, if you want to think of it. And
Mm-hmm.
that is all about thinking ahead and sort of doing what you've just said, which is, where do I want to be? Okay. And how am I going, what do I want to become? And what road do you need to take to get there?
Mm-hmm.
It's all about persuasion. It's all about planning it in advance so that you're at your best when it comes to influencing those decisions. So it's interesting because you're saying that, and I'm like, wow. Another person, I did a video on him, Jack Trout from the 1980s. He's one of the biggest influencers on marketers, and his books and his work was all about positioning yourself for the future rather than the now. Okay, so you go, where do I want to be? Or in the case of the education and awareness of chief information security officer, where do I want to be when it comes to awareness, behavior, and culture? Not now, but in 3 years' time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because when you think about how long it takes to make a video, okay, it's just this is going to take me a while. So you have got to be ambitious and not settle for where you think you should be now, but where you want to be in 3 years' time. Because if you get to the end of 3 years and you've ticked everything off, you're actually 3 years behind. Does that make sense?
Exactly. I think many times, and I found myself in this trap of, people that are in awareness-based or culture behavior-based roles tend to get requested for help or with help, for a lot of things, right? Please help me communicate this. Please help us do this. What is your opinion on this? And sometimes if we don't schedule into our calendars, focus time of where do we want to be, we'll find ourselves in that trap of just constantly doing things for right now. We have to address this issue right now. We have to communicate this change right now. And if you get stuck in that trap, it sometimes is really difficult to get out of it. And so I think really, really, it's so important to just always have that mindset of where do we want to be, and keep that in the back of your mind as you're, doing daily engagements or, culture behavior based activities.
Yeah. But how hard do you think you were in, how big was the team that you were in? Because I think that often, I remember seeing some research by the SANS Institute. It was a couple of years ago now, so it's a little bit older. But my sneaky suspicion it hasn't really changed much. But if I remember rightly, 80% of the people that responded to the survey who were responsible for education and awareness, it was just another hat they were wearing. It wasn't like their full-time job. It was another hat. So, what's how big are the teams that you've been working with, and what sort of impact does having a small team and not having the time to just sit back and, as I call it, rethink, how does that have an impact?
So I kind of have two really unique experiences, right? So in my first role as security awareness, there was a team of 2 of us. And I'm so thankful because I got to learn a lot from the individual I worked with on that team who had been doing security awareness for a few years. And the 2 of us were responsible for both privacy and security awareness training for an organization that had over 30,000 employees. So very massive. And that's a very large responsibility for 2 people.
Yeah.
In my current role now, I am dedicated for our awareness and training initiatives. That is the focus of my role. But our security department, whereas the large, healthcare organization had over 50 members on their security department, we have a much smaller team here, the organization I'm a part of now. And so, coming from a large team to a smaller team and now a global environment, it can be very challenging because of, either cultural differences or time zone differences being global. And so, I think one of the things sometimes that we fall into is I networked with others that kind of wear multiple hats. They might be a security engineer and doing awareness and training. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the majority of cyber risk is human risk. And I think, most organizations in the future will, from my perspective, probably have someone dedicated to awareness and training, but, or culture and behavior. And I think, as others network across the globe, right, around awareness and training activities, I think we can all come together as a community and help each other, especially for those that are wearing multiple hats, and share, free resources or training opportunities or strategies around how to solve certain problems that many of us might be facing. I think when you're in a small team, that really warrants even further the need to network and see things from new perspectives. I can't tell you how many times, networking with someone has allowed me to see a problem that I've been
Yeah.
looking at for a long time. And then there's some sort of obvious solution that I honestly probably never would have thought of if I hadn't networked. And I think it's really important to realize that, no matter how many years of experience you have, and in my case, I only have a couple years of experience doing awareness and training, but regardless of how many years of experience you have, you always want to get different perspectives. And the same goes for video production. I have over 10 years of video production. I've done multiple productions, internationally and for large organizations. And sometimes we get pride that builds up because of our experience. And we think, I know how to do this the best. No one can tell me any differently. And if you have that level of pride, that's really unhealthy. And I can tell you, as much as it hurts to say, I can say certainly I've never created a perfect video. And there is every single video I've created, there's someone out there that isn't going to like it. And you have to realize that that's okay. And there's always room for improvement. And networking, I think, is a key part of that.
That's really interesting. I think there's a real lesson there, is that not everyone's going to like what you've got to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I remember speaking to somebody who's really, really well respected in terms of marketing. And they said, well, actually, that process of splitting an audience in two, ideally you want the biggest piece of the audience to like what you're saying, but it's actually a healthy exercise, because then you realize that you can, right, I'm using this communication method, I'm using this content and this narrative and all these type of things, and for this other audience I've got to come up with a different approach. And it might actually even being able to stand up and say, hey, it's me, they just don't like me.
Right.
don't like me. So then you find another ambassador, who they do like, who just does things different. And I think that's really, I think it's important to realize that you can't actually make everybody happy.
Right.
And if you can accept that, it means that I think you don't have to be perfect with the people that are drawn to you. I don't think you have to be perfect. I think that's where you can produce a video which has got room for improvement. But then again, what's the return on making those marginal changes?
Right.
If it took another month to do it, okay, what's the value of having the content with the audience for an extra month compared to those really small changes that you're going to make by, adding, filtering things as slightly differently or whatever, editing things from a video perspective. Okay. So a bit more about, what you've been doing and challenges. I'm particularly interested around the culture side, because I know that you did do your first trip outside of the United States was Guatemala, wasn't it?
Yes. Yep. My first time flying internationally, I flew all by myself with all of my video equipment to Guatemala, and I put together some marketing materials and several different videos for an orphanage down there.
And what did you find? Because up until that date, you've been doing all your work in the US. I mean, even, you go East Coast to West Coast, everything in the middle as well, North, South. It is culturally really, really diverse in many ways in terms of the values that are prevalent in those different parts of the world, just like in any other country. What is it that going to Guatemala taught you about how things can sometimes be, how the same thing gets done, but done differently in different cultures?
I think one of the things that was most surprising to me was I hadn't really considered the language barrier, right? And so when it comes to culture, there's not only the language barrier of a large majority of people there didn't speak English. And so I was trying to learn, their language and be able to communicate with them in different ways. But then there's also this cultural difference where what I might say or do in English might mean something to people in the US that means something completely different in, Guatemala. And so I really learned that I had to be much more sensitive, and I also had to be more curious about learning. One of the things that I kind of had the wrong perception of when it came to culture was this idea that, research the culture, know everything you need to know, and then you'll be fine. And what I found was the people in Guatemala and other areas that I've traveled to, when I'm curious and I ask questions and I say, hey, I don't actually know how best to communicate. What do you say for this? Or how do you communicate this? When you have that curiosity, people tend to reciprocate that with excitement. People in Guatemala were so excited to tell me about their culture, to explain to me how I could communicate differently or better while I was down there. And so I think one of the things that it can be dangerous is if you go into a new culture and, you stop the curiosity and you start thinking, they expect me to know these things, which largely isn't the case. And I think it's important to do your research, but it's also important to have that curiosity, because some of the things that I would research about Guatemala were not true. Some of the things that I thought, weren't true. And some of the things that I read about were the opposite. And so it's super important to keep that in mind. And culturally in our global environment, taking away some of the lessons I've gotten from Guatemala and my other video productions, when we're communicating change from security, there's kind of three elements to the culture piece that I think about. And, I think about, one, is what we're communicating truthful? And security loves to say that, they know everything that they're talking about. So obviously it's truthful from their perspective, right? Is it timely? So is it the right time to communicate? And then the cultural element that I really try to stress is it the right tone? And I think security loves the first two. They love to be truthful. They love to be timely, but the tone element can be different based on culture, how we come across and how we communicate, even the vehicle that we communicate, based on the culture, based on the region, based on, who it is we're talking to, that might need to be adjusted. And so I think those were some of the largest lessons I learned, being in an entirely new environment in Guatemala.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, culture is one of the things. I think it's the proverbial elephant in the room. I think sometimes when I think of physically an elephant, it's the one thing that's metaphorically, we're looking at it and we're thinking it's too big to eat. Okay. It's like we're looking at it going, this isn't something you can address really quickly by just, swallowing it all in one go. It does remind me, it's like, I can't, it's like, how would you eat something that's that big? And you just take it a bite at a time. And I do think that the industry's looked at culture and it's like, hasn't really tackled it because we've seen it as being too big a thing to address. And actually it's just like, well, actually just take it a bit at a time, a bite at a time, and you can eventually eat through the proverbial elephant in the room. Though I would never recommend eating an elephant anyway, because they are endangered and we love them. So so don't go out and try eating an elephant if you do education and awareness. It's not going to help the problems anyway. But I think it's interesting that the point you're making there around culture, the language piece is really important. We've got a couple of guests coming on who are going to be talking about linguistics and the power of language. Because if you think about everything that we do, it's, language, even in the video context, there's the visual side of it, but then there's the language. But then you go, it's not just the language though, is it? Because culturally, mannerisms. So I know I've moved to France relatively recently, and you just see how people talk. They don't just talk with a mouth. It's physical, it's hand gestures. That's the same in lots of different countries around the world. And so that's almost like a cultural expression of what's important to you coming through. And I know some of my work at the Rethinking the Human Factor in the early days around research, and just the whole translating piece where you get somebody to translate English. So the official language is English for an organization, and that they need to communicate to, let's say, Guatemala, Spanish. I think the official language in Guatemala is Spanish. There's a lot of other languages as well, more native languages. But often something goes missing in that translation. And it's like, something goes missing because it's like there are fewer words than in the English language. So the English language, there's a huge number of words. That enables English speakers to be very, very specific about something. Whereas sort of, I guess, more Latin type of languages seem to have less words. And you can have the same word have different meanings in different contexts. And actually, a core part of language is in reading in between the lines, not reading the lines. And so it might translate from English to Spanish or English to French or English to whatever, but actually it doesn't have the meaning, the context, that reading in between the lines piece, which is just a way of thinking. And if you go to any, speak with anybody that's obviously whose language is Arabic in nature, you don't read from left to right, do you? You read from right to left. But we ask them to read, and your brain gets used to reading from right to left. So what is the impact? How much harder is it for somebody to consciously have to stop thinking about reading from right to left, and they have to read from left to right? How does that actually have an impact upon how much content you give them, because the more content they've got, the harder it is for them to digest. Just from if you think about if you just look, you're looking at your screen now, you look from left to right, okay, and then look from right to left, and you have to consciously do it, don't you?
Yeah, it slows me down.
It slows you down. Yeah. It's harder work. Okay, and it's even the layout of a page. You speak to web designers, and so if you're looking at a screen and you read normally from left to right, where on the screen is it best to put your content? It's like left, isn't it? Yeah. Whereas if you're somebody that reads from right to left, you're on the right. And it's really interesting, because when I've spoken to people who like content writers and content designers, etc., they're picking up on that. And then people do that like mapping of what people are looking at. And you're like, okay, well, people don't actually read sentences. Have you ever come across that? They tend to read the opening bit, and our brains fill in a lot of the information. There's something that we use in one of our training courses where we present a paragraph and there are words missing, but people fill the words in. Their brains just fill the words in, because they sort of, that's what we do. That's how our brains work. That's one of the tricks of our brains. And you're like, okay, so when you get people to look, if they read from left to right, put the content in the left-hand side. If you look at how a page is, on the right, it's generally a lot more space than there is on the left, because it's the bit on the left that they read first. And that's the bit that actually seems to stick with them. Yeah. So, and that's just purely down to your culture, the language you learn, and how you learn to read and write, And,
and I think, I know we're getting close to running out of time. So I guess one of the last things I'll just state too is, and this kind of relates to security awareness training and video production especially, is you really do have to make sure that you are humble to receive feedback that might be completely, different than what you expected. I've created what I thought to be a perfect video, or what I thought to be a perfect training experience, send it off for feedback, and I would have, 5 people say, that's amazing, that's perfect. And then you get the one person that comes back and they might say, not exactly this, right? But they might make me feel as though they said, that's terrible, this sucks, you have to redo all of this. But I can tell you that one person that comes back with that constructive feedback, or they say, you need to redo this, 9 times out of 10, that helps me improve and make a much better product at the end of the day. And when it comes to culture, I found key people that understand culture globally and understand culture regionally and organizationally. And those are those key people that I think, okay, I need to get feedback from them on the things that I'm doing, because they might know the culture better than I do. And I need to be prepared to hear what you did was wrong. And that's okay. And you have to have that humility to be able to accept that, because, that's how you grow, and that's how you get better. That's how you improve. And that's how you ultimately reach the end goal, which is not being the perfect person or making the perfect materials. It's, I want to influence culture and behavior. And that doesn't mean that I get it right every time. It means that I'm, having a coordinated effort and ending up with the best product that I can, through that feedback and through that teamwork.
Colin, it's been absolutely fantastic having this chat with you, pushing ideas around. I knew when we've spoken before, and I thought, yes, this will be a great conversation and some great nuggets to share with all the listeners. Thank you very much for joining us, and it's been great to have you on the show.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bruce. I really appreciate being here.
Hi there. Well, I hope you found that discussion with Colin interesting. I did. I know when we first had a sort of a reach out conversation and had a chat about the possibility of coming on the show, it was quite clear from listening to him that, he's deeply passionate about the subject, and that actually he's drawing quite a lot upon his experience in terms of film production, basically producing content, and his experience of actually producing content in terms of managing those relationships with stakeholders. Some of the lessons that he learned from that I thought were really, really interesting. And in the conversations that we've had as well, it's sort of, as he's talking things through, we're then sort of relating it back to lessons that we learned around how behaviours are formed and influenced. And hopefully we've been able to share some of that in that interview that we just had. So yeah, really, really enjoyed having a conversation with Corbin. And, he's at relatively beginning of his career, and I'm sure that he's going to do some great stuff.
So, you found that interesting. How would you like to ensure that you don't miss out on any further episodes? Well, the best way to do that really is to either subscribe via your preferred podcast platform, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, for example. Alternatively, go and register with the social media profiles for Proofpoint, or come and register with my own social media profile as well on Twitter and LinkedIn. Hopefully that way you should never miss out another episode. So who have we got for the sixth and final episode in this cybersecurity mini-series with Proofpoint? Well, we've got somebody coming on for Proofpoint with the responsibility of bringing all the previous 5 episodes together. So that's a massive task considering the breadth that we've covered. They are a great ambassador for the human-centered approach around cybersecurity. And I know from the conversations I've had with them, it's going to be actually a lot of fun having that conversation as well. So, look, it'd be great to have you come and join us next week. Come and tune into the show and hopefully give you some gold nuggets and some insights to take away to help you rethink the human factor within your own organizations. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye.